C-47 transport plane struggles to find a way through a monster storm front in the skies above Nebraska. Suddenly, there's a massive lightning flash, and the plane falls from the sky. The crash leaves a scene of complete devastation on the ground.
There are some sights that I've seen, and I just had to leave. When I was young, I just couldn't take it.
A group of young trainee fighter pilots, all eager to join the war, die in the tragedy.
I just don't think she ever truly recovered. There was this 24-year-old young man on that plane. That was my dad.
Official investigations at the time are unable to agree on the exact cause of the crash.
There's a lot of unanswered questions about what really caused the accident.
The relatives didn't have any idea what happened.
So what caused the C-47 crash more than 70 years ago? Was it the severe weather conditions? Was it structural failure? Or perhaps tragic human error?
Maybe lightning struck one of the fuel tanks and caused it to explode.
Or could it have been an angry argument that sowed the seeds of disaster?
To hell with you, I'm gonna go get these guys up there myself.
And could a similar incident occur today?
Certainly any flight, even flights today, Mother Nature is very, very dangerous.
However confident you are your aeroplane's going to be all right, you're never sure how bad it can get.
70 years on, can World War II air crash detective Garth Barnard finally discover the truth?
I don't even know if that's even possible. I've never even heard of anything like that.
For more than 20 years, Garth Barnard has been investigating UK World War II air crashes. They are his passion. Garth's usual cases involve RAF aircraft and crews, but today something very different has caught his eye on the internet.
I was looking over historical forums recently, and I found reference to a crash of a C-47 where 28 people were killed. That's a huge loss of life for a wartime accident, and there seems a bit of uncertainty as to what actually happened, and I really need to find out more.
Another hot and humid day is drawing to a close on Bruning Army Air Field on the great Nebraskan plains of the USA. A C-47 transport plane is getting ready to take to the air. The plane, piloted by Captain Stanley Meadows, is about to ferry 24 trainee fighter pilots and flight instructors on a routine flight up to the Pierre gunnery range in neighboring South Dakota.
Captain Meadows at the time was assistant director of training. He was essentially the third person in charge on the base.
Meadows' co-pilot is Captain Robert Bud Bowley, a married 25-year-old.
He was fun, he was happy, he was well-liked, and he was very handsome.
Among the other passengers making the trip are the unmistakable Jolly twins, who are heading to Pierre to continue their training on the P-47 Thunderbolt fighter.
They both got to the Air Corps, and they got there together. They're pretty enthusiastic about flying the Thunderbolt.
An hour into their flight, as it flies over the small town of Naper on the South Dakota-Nebraskan border, the plane runs into problems. The hot August weather has created a stormy weather system, and a huge menacing range of thunderclouds now blocks its route. The pilots are expecting a possible problem weather front, but what they now face is the stuff of nightmares.
Weather in Nebraska can be pretty dangerous. It can be very intimidating. It can change really quickly. You can have a normal summer day. In the morning, you're out playing, and that afternoon, you could have thunderstorms and tornadoes rolling in. Really heavy winds, dangerous lightning and hail. I mean, it's really eerie. It's really scary.
As the plane flies nearer to the storm, it's buffeted by strong winds and high turbulence, and Captain Meadows realizes he has to find a gap in the clouds through which he can safely fly the aircraft. Suddenly, there's a huge lightning flash, and the C-47 is put into an uncontrollable dive. Meadows and Bowley struggle desperately with the controls, but to no avail. Seconds later, the aircraft smashes into the rain-soaked hillside. All 28 passengers and crew are killed instantly.
From what I've read, it seems like the aircraft was brought down by adverse weather conditions. The C-47 is a very robust aircraft. So, could turbulence have brought it down? I mean, could a lightning strike have actually brought it down? I mean, the pilots were aware of the adverse weather conditions, so why did they even risk that? This was one of the biggest crashes of wartime America, and I just got to find out more.
Garth's investigation begins at the museum in Belvedere, Nebraska. Together with original researcher Dale Huskey, local author Patrick Healy has spent many years researching the mysterious crash that has become known simply as the Naper28.
Well, I think the fascinating part for me was the number of casualties and the fact that there was such a horrific accident. There just wasn't any information available. Not a lot of people knew about it. The casualties on board weren't just names. They were human beings who had lives, who had stories before the crash. And I had found a photograph that a widow had sent me that shows Captain Meadows, the pilot, and Captain Boley, the co-pilot of the plane that night. So it really brings the story to life. It gives it a human face. It tells their story.
Patrick shows Garth the official accident report that was compiled in the aftermath of the crash by senior US AAF personnel at Bruning.
This basically covers everything from the weather conditions, the condition of the plane, photographs of the wreckage, maps of the crash site, witness statements, affidavits from people on the ground at Bruning, the weather officer, the flight line officers, and so forth. So if you really want to learn the facts about what happened that night from the Army Air Corps' point of view and from witnesses' standpoint and the accident investigators, the accident report is a great place to start.
This is Garth's first look at the report. What information does it reveal about the doomed plane?
This is the official accident report for the C-47 crash, and it presents a detailed and a horrific account of the final moments of that aircraft.
According to the investigators' account, the C-47 flew into a storm cloud where a massive lightning flash caused the motors to stop. Moments later, the plane was seen exiting the bottom of the cloud at a steep angle before rolling over onto its back as the right wing and other parts of the plane came away from the fuselage. The aircraft then crashed into a shallow ravine and slid to the bottom where it was engulfed in flames.
There was no way the pilot could recover from this crash. I mean, it was horrific. There's some quirky details here. I mean, for example, and I quote, "The edge of the right wing, which broke away from the center section, indicates failure of the top surface in tension. The wingtip section of this wing was bent parallel to the span and concave on the underside. This would indicate terrific overloading on the upper surface of the wing, and it is believed that the plane was upside down when inside the cloud and hit a terrific updraft in this position." Well, when we look at that, when most aircraft, the wing fails, the wing is going to fail in an upward direction. In this instance, the wing went underneath the aircraft like this. I mean, I don't even know if that's even possible. I've never even heard of anything like that.
The report confirms that the plane was sound mechanically and that it had been flying through other moderate turbulence without problems in the days leading up to the crash.
On the face of it, it seems to have been some sort of extreme weather event that caused this crash. But can lightning and turbulence really cause such a catastrophic event? I mean, and also, if the weather was that bad, why would the pilot push on through?
It didn't take long for suspicions about the crash to arise, and rumours to start that were met by a wall of official silence.
There's a lot of rumors. Because the airplane broke up in mid-air, the government thought it was sabotage. And for 55 years, that thing was closed down. The relatives didn't have any idea what happened.
And what of the grieving relatives? How did the tragedy affect them? Garth wants to find out more. He finds that Bud Bowley, the co-pilot, was only on the flight by sheer chance. His daughter, Bobby Kusk, just 4 months old at the time, shows Garth the wallet that Bud was carrying that evening.
You can see the billfold or the wallet is just really, really in tough shape, but it's been through a lot. And everything, even the pictures, are in it. Here is mother and father. And that is my cousin Kathy. I'm not even in here. All his papers were in here. It was something else. Just what you'd find in a normal wallet, except it hasn't been through a plane crash and a fire.
Bud Bowley left the Fairbury family home he shared with his wife Dolores, as usual, to go to nearby Bruning Army Air Base to oversee a group of instructor pilots and trainees.
Mom said the last time she saw him was he was standing on the porch smoking a cigarette. And she went out to say goodbye, and he said, bye, see you later. And off he went.
Fate then intervened for the first time. Dolores called to say that the family car was stuck in the garage and she wouldn't be able to pick Bud up.
She called him and said, I cannot get there because they haven't finished with the car yet. And he said, that's okay. I haven't watched my boys fly at night. I can stay out here and watch them fly at night.
Although by rights he shouldn't even have been there, Bud bumped into Captain Meadows, who was looking for a crew for a flight he was about to make in a C-47. Meadows asked Bud to be his co-pilot. Bud agreed, and his fate was sealed. Naturally, Bud's sudden death came as a terrible shock to his young wife Dolores.
She was just in such a state of shock, and she said, I was 23 years old. I felt my life was over. And she said, I wouldn't let go of you. She said, you had rash because I held you so tight and so much. She said, but I just couldn't let go. Grandma Lil had asked her, what if that isn't Bud in the coffin? And Mother said, it won't make any difference because somebody else is taking care of him.
To help him, Garth feels that he needs to understand a little more about the men who died in the C-47. Why was it so important for the plane to push on through the terrifying storm? The majority of those aboard the plane were pilots learning to fly the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. This machine was a big beast, bristling with machine guns, and with the ability to fire rockets or drop bomb loads of 2,500 pounds. The P-47 was a highly effective ground attack aircraft and a very useful fighter escort for bombers. But with that much firepower and a fully loaded flying weight of 8 tons, it took some seriously skilled pilots to fly it. The aim for most US Air Force trainees was to be a fighter pilot in planes such as the P-47. Clayton and Leonard Jolly, who were twins from California, were those sort of men. Already enlisted in the infantry and promoted to second lieutenants by 1943, they were confident young men who had come to see flying as a way to improve their odds of surviving the war, as this letter written by Clayton to his parents makes clear.
There's nothing about this mess that is safe. When you get to combat, the bullets don't go around picking out the bum ones. Len and I both feel that when you're up in a plane fighting, the best man wins.
I think my dad was a little envious of the twins because here were these two good-looking guys that just seemed to do everything. They were stars on the football team, and they had, I don't know how many girls, but they had a lot of girls chasing them. They were just good-looking guys, very popular, and he looked up to them and had nothing but wonderful things to say about them.
By mid-1944, Clayton and Leonard had transferred from the infantry, been through flight school together, and had arrived at Bruning Army Air Force Base in Nebraska to finally get to grips with the P-47. As he tries to piece together the story, Garth wants to know more about life at the base, the life of which the Jolly twins were very much part. Built in 1942, local historian Janet Bartels has extensively researched Bruning's wartime past.
The role of the airfield was to train pilots to fly the P-47s, and they would do a lot of low-line flying and dogfighting maneuvers to practice, so their skill level was very, very high. To run the airbase, there were 500 civilians and over 3,000 officers working here at the airbase, so there was a big influx of income and money into the area.
Corrine Baruth Kortzman worked on the base during the war and remembers the pilots well.
They were very sure of themselves. That's the reason I never dated them. They were aggressive. Let's just say they were aggressive. They were fun-loving, that they were. It was busy, and there were planes flying all the time. It was very exciting until the war started touching, and then it became serious business.
Sometimes powerful machines, youthful in experience, and wartime pressures were a fatal mix, as Corrine and Janet recall.
Training accidents at the base were very common. You have to remember these young men were only in their 20s, early 20s, and when you put a piece of machinery that can go 500 miles an hour in their hands, training accidents were very common.
It seemed like for a time that we had one every day. One day this plane came over the roof, flew so low, and as it went over, I said, oh boy, the base commander's going to be court-martialing him. And just then there was this crash, explosion, and my boss ran out of his office, came back about 40 minutes later, white as a sheet, told us what happened. This pilot had flown into a telephone pole and decapitated himself.
Garth has discovered that life on base was an intoxicating mix of exhilaration, excitement, and danger. Risk-taking became part of everyday life. Could a certain gung-ho attitude among those aboard have contributed to the cause of the crash? Although Bruning was not alone in experiencing a high number of crashes, Garth finds that the base's incident rate so alarmed the authorities that in the summer of 1944, its commander, Colonel Charles Steed, was replaced. The reason given was a perceived lack of discipline among Brunel's personnel. The base's new commander was Colonel Charles McAllister. McAllister was a strict disciplinarian and a veteran fighter pilot who had stamped his authority on the base, as one pilot was to find out.
There was one particular instructor pilot who was reported buzzing the town of Beatrice, Nebraska, and he had flown so low over the buildings that the people were able to get the number off the side of his plane, and they called back to the base. And when he got back, Colonel McAllister grounded him, wouldn't let him fly anymore, and within 2 months, he had been discharged from the military. Colonel McAllister court-martialed him. He was that serious about making sure that these guys lived to go do what they were being trained to do.
The pilots were desperately needed. In the wake of the D-Day landings in Europe, the P-47s and their pilots had a vital role to play in supporting the Allied advance through France and Germany. McAllister was determined that his strict new regime was going to get them there in good shape. So there was now tougher discipline at Bruning, which leads Garth to another theory. Could McAllister's new approach actually have contributed to an argument that helped cause the Naper crash? Interviews conducted with servicemen, pilots, and officers on the base by Pat Healy and Dale Huskey give Garth a fascinating picture of the events before the plane took off. At about 5:30 p.m. on August 3rd, the C-47, flown by its usual pilot, First Lieutenant Wayne Palmer, touched down on the baking hot runway after an uneventful 7-hour flight from Colorado Springs. On the ground, the men due to fly in it to Pierre were waiting. Palmer and his crew retired to the officers' club to grab a meal, a drink, and a well-deserved rest after a punishing few days, but they were met by Captain Stanley Meadows, the base's third-in-command. Captain Meadows was clearly impatient to get the C-47 back up in the air and the trainees up to Pierre as soon as possible. But Palmer, who was tired, hungry and thirsty, had other ideas and flatly refused.
Captain Meadows at the time was assistant director of training, and you really didn't tell that person no. But Lieutenant Palmer felt that he was too tired to fly, and he let Captain Meadows know that. Captain Meadows and he exchanged some profanities. The argument became a little bit heated, and Captain Meadows told Lieutenant Palmer basically, to hell with you, I'm gonna go get these guys up there myself.
An angry and agitated Meadows stormed out and set about finding a new crew for the flight, a crew which included the unfortunate Bud Boley. With a crew in place, Meadows went over to the weather station to hear the weather forecast. Meteorologist Lieutenant Theodore Gianos was on duty that evening. In the official accident report, Gianos stated that he had warned Meadows about powerful thunderstorms forming just south of their destination. He alleges that Meadows seemed anxious and in a hurry to leave the station, and that as he did so, he muttered that there was just too much weather on the report Gianos had given him.
From the people that I've spoken with, it's kind of my opinion that Captain Meadows may have had his pride or his ego bruised a little bit in the officers' club in front of everybody. And it almost seems as if it was something that he couldn't back down. His credibility, his authority as an officer is on the line. His reputation has been called out. He's got to make that right. And so he storms out and tells Palmer, to hell with you, I'll get them there myself. And I think that starts the ball rolling, where when he comments to Lieutenant Gianos, boy, there's a lot of weather on this, it appears that Captain Meadows is given an out. And it almost seems that he's trying so hard to make this work that it begins to unravel and fail.
Having calmed down a little, Lieutenant Palmer wanted to make sure the plane got away without any problems. So he returned to the C-47 and watched as the passengers and crew prepared for the flight. By 7 p.m., the C-47 was at the end of the runway, waiting for clearance for takeoff. 5 minutes later, the control tower gave the signal, and the heavy plane lumbered down the runway to begin what was to prove to be its last flight. Could Captain Meadows' conduct have been the main reason for the crash? The official report seems to think so, as Garth discovers.
The pilot, Captain Meadows, he does seem to be getting a lot of the blame here. McAllister, his commanding officer, states in the report, and I quote, "Responsibility for the accident is judged to be 100% pilot error in that the pilot used poor judgment in continuing his flight into the storm cloud." Pretty damning stuff.
However, the base's accident committee was not quite so sure. Their report apportions blame as 50% pilot error, 25% material failure, and 25% poor weather forecasting. But there was a sting in the tail.
And the committee have this little punchline, and I quote, "The pilot was not adequately cautious with due consideration for the worth of his cargo." That's pretty damning again. But they do go on to state that they knew Meadows and how he flies, and they also believe that he never would have actually entered a thundercloud like that.
So had Captain Meadows acted recklessly? Perhaps. But Garth has found another piece of evidence that might give a clue as to why the C-47 crashed.
In addition to the anecdotal evidence that Meadows was in a rush to get out of the weather station, we also have the fact that he miscalculated his takeoff weight. He actually stated and wrote down here in the official document that it was 27,537 pounds, when the investigators recalculated that to be 29,100 pounds, which is actually over the recommended takeoff weight.
It's certainly true that in wartime, rather conservative weight safety limits for aircraft were sometimes exceeded, and that the report doesn't see extra weight as a significant factor in the crash. But for Garth, this information gives more valuable insight into the situation.
The weight was approved by another officer, so you can't completely blame Meadows. And if he was in a rush and not the sort of person you'd say no to, perhaps the other officer said, just go on your way. At the end of the day, Meadows didn't have a death wish, and he knows the capabilities of the plane and the operational limits. So Why would a plane like that just fall out of the sky? Could lightning and turbulence really bring down a C-47 like that?
Even though he had warned Meadows about the weather conditions en route, the meteorologist Gianos didn't try to stop the flight. Obviously, both he and Meadows believed that the rugged C-47 could handle the conditions. Was their faith justified?
The Douglas C-47 Skytrain was the military equivalent of the Douglas DC-3 airliner, which appeared in the late 1930s. A wonderful workhorse, which became, in military and civil service, the ubiquitous transport aircraft all over the world. It was very rugged and dependable. The structure was very strong, and it was a very capable design. It was one of those aircraft that they just got right.
Garth needs to see for himself if a Douglas C-47 could withstand the flight through a thunderstorm. If it could, what could have caused the aircraft's right wing to tear off mid-flight? Rick Adams, a pilot from the Arizona wing of the Commemorative Air Force, has been flying the force's C-47 in demonstrations throughout the United States. In the 5 years he's been flying the aircraft, Rick has encountered all types of weather conditions.
There have been numbers of incidents where they have actually flown into very severe thunderstorms and survived fine. We have had close calls, if you will, on normally, bright, sunny days, but there is storm activity and you go out of your way to avoid it. We've flown the plane in fairly turbulent weather, and it's got a 95-foot wingspan, and so it tends to absorb an awful lot of shock. But I've seen hail come out of the top of a thunderstorm that may spit it out 10 or 15 miles. And so you don't have to be that close to the proximity of a thunderstorm and have, incidents happen.
Witnesses state on the Naper aircraft that the wing collapsed underneath. Do you have an explanation for that?
I really don't. I've seen lots of World War II footage, and traditionally the wing collapses to over the top just simply because it stops creating lift. Maybe lightning struck one of the fuel tanks or both of the fuel tanks. There's two 200-gallon fuel tanks on each wing, and cause it to explode, and basically catastrophic failure of the main spar that runs through the wing that caused it to collapse and go underneath. That's the only thing I can think, because that main spar is very, very strong. And it would take something like that, like an explosion, I would think, to cause that to happen. And it would be catastrophic.
Can a lightning strike cause an aircraft to explode? At the Morgan Body Lightning Laboratory at Cardiff University in Wales, Professor Manu Haddad leads the team who regularly test modern aircraft parts for their ability to withstand a lightning strike. Does he think lightning could have played a part in the C-47's crash?
The aeroplane is designed more or less in a way that it replicates a Faraday cage with the exception of the windows. If you have a box that is completely enclosed with metal, inside it there will be no electrical field. So when lightning hits the aeroplane, it will tend to flow on that shell, which is a metal shell. And we refer to this as a Faraday cage because it's protecting whoever or whatever is inside the cage. So if, say, a lightning strike attaches to the nose of the aeroplane, that will dissipate easily either to the tail or through the wings, depending on the actual position of the aeroplane. Equally, if the lightning hits one of the wings, there is a metallic path to dissipate through the structure and onto the attachment point on the ground or on the cloud. Any other part which is sort of non-conducting away from these areas will be safe. Because it's metal, it's very unlikely that it'll cause major damage. However, if you combine this with other weather conditions, such as wind, you may create a situation where that lightning strike could touch a sensitive part of the aircraft, such as fuel tank areas or pipes going into the engine. It's very tiny, but without being there, it's very difficult to tell.
There is even some debate about whether the flash seen in the sky was caused by lightning at all. Ex-fighter pilot Dale Huskey was one of the first people to investigate the Naper mystery.
5 or 6 people said they saw the airplane flying at a flash of light. Now, some people says it was lightning. I don't know. I don't think so. DC-3 fuel is in the belly. If the wing came off, all that engine, those red hot exhaust are right there. And that gas ignites immediately. Well, the tanks would blow up. So there's your flash of fire. But some people who are not familiar with it say, oh, that was hit by lightning.
As Garth travels to the crash site itself near the small town of Naper, he has a chance to mull over the critical questions. Did an explosion triggered by a lightning strike cause the wing to rip off the C-47? Or was it structural failure which saw the severed wing hit the fuel tanks and cause an explosion that was mistaken for a flash of lightning? Gazing over the now desolate crash site, it's not hard for Garth to imagine the terrible scene all those years ago. The accident report contains a sketch of the crash site, showing a field of debris stretching for over a mile and the exact final resting place of the burning plane. The sketch seems to confirm that the plane had already started to break up before it hit the ground, because it shows that some debris had landed far away from the point of actual impact. This was backed up by one witness statement contained in the report, which also reports a flaming light that could be seen in the fuselage. But the other witness statement disagrees. It says, "I did not see any pieces flying off the airplane at any time, nor did I see any fire on the plane while it was descending." So which version is correct? At what point did the plane catch fire? Garth has managed to track down an eyewitness who saw the plane's final moments. Art Martins, a local resident from the nearby town of Naper, was working just half a mile from where the plane crashed.
And I looked out, and there, that plane was coming out of the sky, out of the clouds. To me, it was just like a ball of fire. That's about all I seen. It was just like a ball of fire, and it was all in a diameter of about 12 feet. That's what I could see from the clouds. And as it went down, they lost the engine about a quarter of a mile away from where it did land. It glided from there along the hills and bounced and hit where this washout ditch was and hit that embankment, and that's when it stopped and they all flew out.
Art has confirmed to Garth that the plane was already on fire before it hit the ground. Art was also one of the first people to arrive at the crash scene, and the horror of it still haunts him today.
But there are some sights that I've seen, and I just had to leave. When I first got there, this guy was up on the bank, on his haunches, and it took me a long time before I ever told anybody this story. His hands were gripped into the mud, grass, and dirt. So while I was turning around and looking, I heard something. I turned around, and he fell over when I had my back turned. He was on his hunches when I first seen him. That's what really got me, because he was still alive when he must have hit that. When I was young, I just couldn't take it.
Art's moving evidence backs up the testimony of original witness Harry Hellenbolt, who says in the accident report that he saw flames as soon as the plane emerged from the bottom of the cloud, before the plane rolled, and before a large piece of the aircraft, most probably the wing, fell off. For Garth, the evidence suggests some kind of ignition happened before the plane broke up. Was a lightning strike really to blame? Before he leaves the United States, Garth wants to find out more about the accident's legacy. Judy Pulliman was just a month old when her father, Leonard Jolly, was killed in the Naper crash, leaving behind his young wife, Dorothy.
There was this 24-year-old young man on that plane. That was my dad. I just don't think she ever truly, really recovered from that, because he was the love of her life. My mom grappled with that for her whole life, not feeling like she reached not success, but reached what she had hoped for, perhaps as a young girl. And very, very depressed by the end. She died when she was 62. She was very young. And just never really came out of it. And so after she had married my stepdad, she talked about my dad a lot, which was not good for my stepdad. And so when she died, she asked my stepdad if she could be buried next to my dad, and he said yes. So it shows me a lot for him, and also shows me how much it meant to my mom.
Garth has sent the research he's gathered from the United States to air safety expert Gary Wan to see what he can glean from the data. With over 30 years in the aviation business, including working at the Air Accident Investigation Branch at Farnborough, Gary focuses on the experience of the pilots and the plane's weight.
Both pilots flying the aircraft had limited experience on multi-engined aircraft. They had a large number of hours, something like 900 hours, so they were both experienced pilots. But that probably would have been gained in single-seat fighter-type aircraft. And handling a larger twin-engine aircraft would be a very different kettle of fish indeed. It's an old design, it's a 1930s design, and it does mean that if the aircraft is heavily loaded, then it has to be manoeuvred in a very gentle fashion. Any abrupt manoeuvres are likely to cause structural damage. And certainly, in the heat of the moment, it might have been possible for them to overstress the aircraft by pushing or pulling too hard on the controls when they're trying to recover, particularly if the aircraft was in an unusual attitude caused by the turbulence in the thunderstorm. And that could, again, have led to structural breakup.
But why was the plane so heavy that evening? Gary believes the amount of fuel on board was at the heart of the problem.
With the task in mind, you wouldn't have expected the pilot to fill the thing with 8 hours of fuel for what was effectively a 2-hour flight. So it does suggest the aircraft was taken as being the next aircraft available on the line. But the policy may have been just to fill the aircraft with fuel after each trip and then fill them up again as required. But certainly I think the weight of the aircraft was a contributing factor to the accident.
With the plane at the limits of its loading capacity, did Gary believe Meadows was truly to blame for taking the plane into a dangerous situation? And how unusual was Naper28?
Certainly any flight, even flights today, Mother Nature is very, very dangerous. And in the early days when we're talking about the C-47, then they would have been much more susceptible to damage from severe weather. And there were known cases, certainly after the war, where C-47s were used by private airlines where the Dakotas did come apart in the air, so it wasn't completely unknown. As far as Meadows, the pilot's concerned, they do seem to place a lot of blame on him, but you do wonder whether or not there was any additional pressure on him to do the task, certainly with the weather as it was at the time.
It seems that severe turbulence was a major cause of the Naper crash. But could something similar happen to modern commercial airliners? Chris Roberts has had a distinguished career as a military and aviation test pilot. He's flown commercial airliners and been part of the Red Arrows. He explains the dangers of turbulence to aircraft today.
Turbulence is always, to an extent, an unknown quantity, because it's that little bit that you never know. However confident you are, your aeroplane's going to be all right. However well strapped in everybody is, crew and passengers, you're never sure how bad it can get. Been one or two instances where a long-haul aeroplane over the Pacific flew into such bad turbulence that the pilots lost control of the aeroplane, and it took them some time to get it back, by which time there were a number of injuries on board and the aeroplane was overstressed due to the air loads that were experienced. But largely, when we talk about turbulence that causes problems either to the structural integrity of the airplane or to throwing passengers up against the top of the cabin, which is something you read about in dramatic stories, then that's due to the huge up and down drafts that you can get associated with turbulence in a major thunderstorm.
With the possibility of powerful and unexpected weather events, how does a modern airliner avoid the dangers?
When you start talking about turbulence, you may be more concerned about what happens inside the airplane than to the airplane itself. No modern airliner is allowed to fly without weather radar. And this is on the nose of the airplane, and it shows the pilot where the worst of the weather is ahead of him. And the pilot then picks his way round the worst regions, which are color-coded. Running into turbulence, particularly if it's unexpected, could result in injuries inside the cabin. So when the captain comes on the PA and says, keep your seatbelt done up, I suggest you keep your seatbelt done up.
Garth is now back from the United States and has had some time to go over all his findings. So what conclusions has he drawn? What does he think caused the Naper crash?
Captain Meadows has always been held responsible for the loss of the 28 men and the crash. But there are other factors, and these mean that he just cannot be blamed. You just cannot blame this on one man.
Garth believes that lightning wasn't to blame, but the pilots found themselves battling a weather system that strained the overloaded C-47's airframe to its limits. Their inexperience of flying in these conditions may have caused Meadows and Bowley to fly by instinct, which, as fighter pilots, meant aggressively throwing the plane around in the storm. The meteorologist had given Meadows a thorough weather forecast warning of the potentially dangerous storm clouds that he would face en route. But for whatever reason, he chose to ignore them.
I believe that although Meadows' actions were the trigger for the accident, the plane encountered a huge force of nature which caused that wingtip to fail, then the wing failing, which then led to the ignition of the petrol tanks. We don't know how much pressure Meadows was under to get those men up to Pierre. Maybe he felt that he had to keep the men's training on schedule, and that if he didn't, he was accountable.
As we've heard, structural failure in extreme weather was not uncommon on the C-47 or its sister aircraft, the DC-3. Maybe the portrayal of Captain Meadows as the villain of the tragedy is just too simplistic. It must be remembered that the damning verdict of Meadows' conduct was made by his base commander, a man who had just seen 25 young trainees killed, the very men he had been brought in especially to look after. Maybe McAllister's anger and frustration got in the way of a fair assessment.
Meadows' actions were the catalyst for the accident, but he did not set out to kill those men, and I firmly believe he was doing what he thought was his duty to help America and the Allies by getting those men up to Pierre.
The Naper tragedy lay buried amongst the many thousands of training deaths that happened in the chaos of the war, until Dale Husky and his fellow researchers finally tried to peer into the darkness to unearth the truth about 28 young men's fate.
These people, these pilots, should know what happened to them. They should know what happened to them.
The exact cause of their deaths may always be debated, but they'll certainly never be forgotten.
Those families suffered a loss just as much as the families whose men were killed overseas.
And I think about those boys now had 70 years on that they never had. I think about that.